The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone plaza of St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Boston, Massachusetts. It was April 14th, 2015, a Tuesday that would later be marked in history books as the day Prince Alexander Voss vanished into thin air. The cathedral, a Gothic revival masterpiece built in 1872, stood as a testament to old-world architecture in the heart of modern America, its spires reaching toward a sky that was beginning to darken with approaching storm clouds. Alexander Voss, 28 years old and the sole heir to the Voss family fortune, a German noble lineage that had established significant financial interests in the United States over 3 generations, had arrived at the cathedral at approximately 3:47 p.m. Security footage from a nearby bank would later confirm this precise timing, showing the prince stepping out of his black Mercedes sedan, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed almost too formal for the casual Tuesday afternoon crowd. His driver, Marcus Chen, a former Secret Service agent who had been with the family for 6 years, would later testify that Alexander had seemed distracted that morning. He kept looking at his phone, Marcus recalled during the initial police interviews, but he wasn't typing anything, just staring at the screen like he was waiting for something that never came. When they arrived at St. Michael's, Alexander had instructed Marcus to wait in the car, saying he needed 20 minutes alone for prayer. It was unusual but not unprecedented. The prince had always been privately religious, a trait he'd inherited from his late father, Duke Friedrich Voss, who had passed away from a heart attack 2 years prior. Inside the cathedral, the air was cool and smelled of incense and old wood. Father Patrick O'Brien, the elderly priest who had served St. Michael's for 43 years, was preparing for evening mass when he noticed Alexander entering through the heavy oak doors. The prince moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling as he walked down the center aisle toward the front pews. Father O'Brien, respecting the obvious need for privacy, nodded politely and retreated to the sacristy, leaving Alexander alone in the vast, empty space. What happened in those 20 minutes would become one of the most analyzed periods of time in recent memory. 3 witnesses, a janitor named Miguel Rodriguez, an elderly woman named Dorothy Walsh who came to light candles for her deceased husband, and a tourist from Japan named Kenji Tanaka, all reported seeing Alexander kneeling in the 3rd pew from the front, his head bowed, his hands clasped together in prayer. None of them noticed anything unusual. No one approached him. No suspicious figures lurked in the shadows. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary scene of a man seeking solace in a house of God. At 4:09 p.m., security cameras positioned at the cathedral's main entrance captured Alexander exiting the building. The footage, which would be played thousands of times by investigators and news outlets alike, shows him pausing at the top of the stone steps, looking left and right as if orienting himself, then descending calmly toward the street. His expression was neutral, perhaps slightly pensive, but showed no signs of distress. He wasn't running. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. There was no indication that anything was wrong. And then, nothing. Alexander Voss simply ceased to exist in any verifiable way. He never returned to his Mercedes. Marcus Chen, growing concerned after 45 minutes of waiting, had entered the cathedral to find it empty, except for Father O'Brien, who confirmed Alexander had left. The security footage from surrounding buildings showed him walking south on Tremont Street, then turning east onto Boylston Street, blending into the afternoon crowd of office workers and students. After that, he disappeared from every camera angle, every witness account, every digital footprint. The alarm was raised at 6:30 p.m. when Alexander failed to arrive at a scheduled dinner meeting with the German consul general. His mother, Duchess Elena Voss, who had been staying at the family's Beacon Hill estate, immediately contacted the Boston Police Department. Within hours, a missing persons case had been opened, though everyone involved knew this was no ordinary disappearance. This was a European prince with potential enemies in the business and political worlds, a young man worth billions, a target for ransom or worse. The investigation that followed was unprecedented in its scope. The FBI joined Boston police within 24 hours, establishing a joint task force that would grow to include 47 full-time investigators. Every frame of security footage within a 5-mile radius of St. Michael's Cathedral was reviewed. Every person who had been in or near the cathedral that afternoon was tracked down and interviewed. Alexander's phone records, bank accounts, email correspondence, and social media activity were forensically analyzed. His apartment in Back Bay was searched top to bottom. His friends, business associates, and distant relatives were questioned repeatedly. Duchess Elena, a formidable woman of 62 with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, held her first press conference 3 days after Alexander's disappearance. The event took place in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, with dozens of cameras capturing every moment. She stood at a podium flanked by American and German flags, her composure remarkable despite the circumstances. "My son is a good man," she said, her accented English precise and measured. "He has no enemies that we know of. He was not in any trouble. Someone has taken him from us, and we will not rest until he is found." She announced a reward of $5 million for information leading to Alexander's safe return. The number made headlines around the world. Tips began pouring in immediately, thousands of them ranging from credible sightings to wild conspiracy theories. Each one had to be investigated. Each one led nowhere. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to reveal a troubling pattern. There were no leads, no ransom demands, no credible witnesses to an abduction, no evidence of foul play. It was as if Alexander had simply decided to walk off the face of the earth. Theories proliferated in the media and online forums. Some suggested Alexander had orchestrated his own disappearance to escape the pressures of his position. Others pointed to potential business rivals. The Voss family had significant holdings in international banking and real estate, sectors rife with cutthroat competition. Political enemies were considered. The family had been vocal critics of certain European nationalist movements, making them potential targets for extremist groups. There were even suggestions of romantic entanglements gone wrong, though Alexander's private life had always been remarkably discreet. By the end of April, the story had become a global phenomenon. The Lost Prince dominated news cycles across continents. Documentary crews requested access to the investigation. Psychics and amateur detectives showed up at the Boston police headquarters with their theories. The cathedral where Alexander was last seen became an unlikely pilgrimage site, with people leaving flowers and notes on its steps. Father O'Brien, thrust unwillingly into the spotlight, gave interviews describing Alexander's final moments in the church, though he could offer nothing that the security footage hadn't already shown. Detective Sarah Mitchell, the lead investigator on the case, was a 20-year veteran of the Boston Police Department with a reputation for solving difficult cases. But this one confounded her. "We've investigated kidnappings, murders, disappearances," she told her partner, Detective James Rodriguez, during one late-night session reviewing evidence. "There's always something. A witness who saw too much, a mistake the perpetrator made, a digital trail. But this, it's like he walked into a void." The investigation expanded internationally. Interpol was contacted. European law enforcement agencies coordinated with their American counterparts. Alexander's movements in the days and weeks before his disappearance were reconstructed in minute detail. He had attended a charity gala 2 nights before vanishing, giving a speech about refugee support. He had met with his financial advisors that Monday morning discussing routine investment strategies. He had lunch with his mother at their estate. Everything was normal, mundane even. There were no warning signs, no deviations from his usual routine except for that inexplicable visit to St. Michael's Cathedral. By mid-May, the tone of the investigation began to shift. Without evidence of a crime, without any proof that Alexander hadn't left voluntarily, resources began to be redirected. The FBI scaled back their involvement, leaving the case primarily in the hands of the Boston police. The daily press briefings became weekly, then stopped altogether. The reward money remained unclaimed. The thousands of tips had all been followed up and dismissed. Duchess Elena, her composure finally beginning to crack, withdrew from public view, maintaining a vigil at the family estate with a dwindling circle of advisors and friends. As spring turned to summer and summer faded into early autumn, the case grew cold in the official sense, though it never left the public consciousness. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Online communities shared theories and conducted their own investigations. Some believed Alexander was dead, murdered and disposed of so expertly that his body would never be found. Others insisted he was alive, held somewhere against his will, waiting for rescue that might never come. The most cynical observers suggested it was all an elaborate hoax, though to what end remained unclear. Detective Mitchell never stopped working the case, even as her caseload grew with new crimes demanding attention. She kept Alexander's file on her desk, reviewing it whenever she had spare moments, looking for the detail she might have missed. The photograph on the cover showed Alexander at the charity gala, smiling at the camera, looking every bit the privileged prince he was, handsome, confident, unburdened. She often wondered if that man still existed somewhere, or if he had become another statistic, another unsolved mystery to haunt the department for years to come. Fim do capítulo 10, 0 caracteres. Posso continuar para o capítulo 2? Continue em inglês e mantenha o próximo capítulo com 10. 0 caracteres. Chapter 2, October 12, 2020, began as an unremarkable Monday morning at the Voss estate in Beacon Hill. The mansion, a 3-story federal-style building dating back to 1824, sat on a quiet street lined with gas lamps and brick sidewalks, a pocket of old-world elegance in the heart of Boston. Duchess Elena had barely slept, as had become her routine over the past 6 months. She spent most nights in her late husband's study, surrounded by photographs of Alexander from childhood through adulthood, praying to a God she was no longer certain was listening. Her assistant, Margaret Hoffman, a German woman in her 50s who had served the family for 2 decades, found her there at dawn. "You need to rest, Elena," Margaret said softly, using the informal address that their long relationship permitted in private. "You're destroying yourself." The Duchess looked up, her face gaunt and aged beyond her years. The past 6 months had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. Her hair, once meticulously maintained, now showed prominent gray roots. "How can I rest when my son is out there somewhere?" she replied, her voice hoarse from crying. The house staff moved quietly through their duties that morning, maintaining the routines that gave structure to the household even in its darkest period. Thomas Brennan, the groundskeeper, was trimming hedges along the front gate. Maria Santos, the cook, was preparing breakfast that would likely go uneaten. Security personnel, doubled since Alexander's disappearance, monitored cameras and conducted regular perimeter checks. The estate had become a fortress, though what they were protecting against remained unclear. At 9:47 a.m., everything changed. Thomas was near the front gate when he heard something, a scraping sound like feet dragging across pavement. He looked up from his work and saw a figure stumbling up the street toward the estate. The man was thin, almost skeletal, wearing filthy clothes that hung off his frame. His hair was long and matted, his face obscured by an unkempt beard. Thomas's first instinct was to call security, thinking a homeless person had wandered into the neighborhood. But something about the way the man moved, the desperate purpose in his unsteady gait, made Thomas hesitate. The figure reached the gate and collapsed against it, his hands gripping the iron bars. When he looked up, Thomas saw his eyes, blue eyes that seemed to burn with an intensity that was both frightening and familiar. "Please," the man croaked, his voice barely audible. I need to see my mother." Thomas felt his blood turn cold as recognition dawned. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. "Mr. Alexander?" he whispered, unable to believe what he was seeing. The response was immediate and chaotic. Thomas shouted for security while fumbling with his keys to unlock the gate. Guards came running from their posts. Margaret heard the commotion from inside and rushed to the window, her hand flying to her mouth when she saw the figure being supported by 2 security guards. She ran through the house screaming for the Duchess, her careful composure shattered. "He's here! Alexander is here! He's alive!" Duchess Elena emerged from the study in a state of confusion and disbelief. She descended the main staircase just as the front door burst open, and the security team helped Alexander inside. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Mother and son locked eyes across the marble foyer, both frozen in shock. Then Elena let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream, rushing forward to embrace the son she had thought lost forever. But as she drew closer, she saw what 6 months had done to him. Alexander had always been fit, athletic, weighing around 185 pounds on his 6-foot frame. The man before her couldn't weigh more than 140 pounds. His clothes, a torn flannel shirt and stained jeans that clearly weren't his own, hung on him like a scarecrow's outfit. His face was hollow, cheekbones prominent, eyes sunken, but worse than the weight loss were the scars. 3 parallel lines ran down the right side of his face from temple to jawline, angry red marks that looked like they'd been made by something hot. His neck bore similar marks, along with what appeared to be burn scars in a pattern that Elena couldn't make sense of. When Alexander raised his trembling hands to embrace her, she saw his palms and fingers were covered in white scar tissue, some wounds still healing, pink and raw at the edges. "My God," Elena whispered, her hands hovering over his face, afraid to touch him, afraid she might hurt him, or discover he was an apparition that would dissolve at contact. "My God, Alexander, what happened to you?" Alexander's response was to collapse into her arms, his body shaking with silent sobs. The security team immediately called 911, while Margaret rushed to get blankets and water. Within minutes, the house was swarming with activity. Detective Sarah Mitchell received the call at 10:03 a.m. while reviewing case files at her desk. "Mitchell here," she answered, expecting routine business. The voice on the other end belonged to Sergeant David Park from the Beacon Hill precinct. "Sarah, you need to get to the Voss estate right now. Alexander Voss just showed up at his front gate." Mitchell's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor and splashing hot liquid across her pants. She didn't notice. "Say that again," she demanded. "Alexander Voss. He's alive. He just came home. EMTs are there now, and the family is requesting you specifically." The drive to Beacon Hill normally took 20 minutes. Mitchell made it in 12, running 3 red lights and using her siren the entire way. Her partner, Detective James Rodriguez, met her at the estate gates, his expression mirroring her own shock and disbelief. "He's inside with the EMTs," Rodriguez said as they hurried toward the house. "I haven't seen him yet, but the first responders say he's in rough shape. Malnourished, dehydrated, covered in scars. They want to transport him to Massachusetts General immediately." Inside, the foyer had been converted into a makeshift triage area. 2 paramedics were checking Alexander's vital signs while a third tried to start an IV line. Duchess Elena stood nearby, refusing to leave her son's side, while Margaret hovered anxiously with blankets and pillows. When Mitchell entered, she had to suppress a gasp. The man on the stretcher bore little resemblance to the polished prints in the case file photos. This Alexander Voss looked like he'd been to war and barely survived. "Mr. Voss," Mitchell said gently, approaching the stretcher. "I'm Detective Sarah Mitchell. I've been leading the investigation into your disappearance. Can you tell me what happened?" Alexander's eyes focused on her with difficulty. He opened his mouth to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. The lead paramedic, a woman named Jessica Torres, intervened. "Detective, he's severely dehydrated and malnourished. He needs immediate medical attention. You can question him at the hospital." But Alexander grabbed Mitchell's sleeve with surprising strength for someone in his condition. Not the hospital," he managed to say. "Not safe. They might find me again." His eyes showed genuine terror. Mitchell exchanged glances with Rodriguez. "Who might find you, Mr. Voss? Who did this to you?" Alexander's grip tightened. "The priest," he whispered. "Father Victor," he said. "Said it was purification. Said nobles needed to suffer like Christ suffered." The paramedics insisted on transport but agreed to take Alexander to a private room under a false name for security purposes. Mitchell and Rodriguez followed the ambulance to Massachusetts General Hospital, calling in FBI support en route. Whatever had happened to Alexander Voss over the past 6 months, it was clearly criminal, and whoever was responsible needed to be found quickly. If Alexander feared they might come for him again, then time was of the essence. At the hospital, Alexander was taken to a private room on the secure ward, typically reserved for witnesses in federal cases. Doctors conducted immediate examinations while detectives waited outside. Dr. Rachel Goldstein, the attending physician, emerged after an hour with a grim expression. "He's stable but severely traumatized both physically and psychologically," she reported. "The scars are consistent with burns from heated metal implements. Some of the wounds are still healing, suggesting the abuse continued until very recently. He has evidence of repeated beatings, malnutrition consistent with prolonged captivity, and signs of dehydration. Whoever held him wanted him to suffer." Mitchell was granted permission to conduct a brief interview, with the understanding that Alexander's medical needs took priority. She entered the room to find him propped up in bed, an IV in his arm, his mother sitting beside him holding his scarred hand. "Mr. Voss," Mitchell began, pulling up a chair. "I know this is difficult, but we need to understand what happened so we can find the people responsible. Can you start from the beginning? What happened after you left St. Michael's Cathedral on April 14th? Alexander took a shaky breath, his eyes distant as he recalled memories that were clearly painful. "I was leaving the cathedral," he began, his voice weak but clear. "A man approached me on the street. He was wearing priest's robes. He said he recognized me, said he had information about my father's death, something the family needed to know. He asked me to come with him to a more private location to discuss it. I was curious. My father's death had always seemed sudden, unexplained. I thought maybe this priest knew something." He paused, accepting water from his mother before continuing. "We walked a few blocks. He led me to a van parked in an alley. When I got close, someone grabbed me from behind. They put something over my face, chloroform, I think. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a stone room, underground, chained to a wall. Cold. So cold. And dark except for candles. There were 4 men there, all wearing religious robes. And him. Father Victor Hahn. He said I'd been chosen for purification, that my family's wealth and privilege were sins that needed to be burned away, that God had commanded him to save my soul through suffering." Mitchell took careful notes, her hand steady despite her racing heart. "Can you describe where you were held? Any details about the location?" Alexander nodded slowly. "It was old. Stone walls, vaulted ceiling, like a chapel or monastery basement, very isolated. I never saw outside during the day. They kept me in the dark except during the rituals. But I could hear wind sometimes, strong wind, and it was always cold. Even in summer it was cold. I think we were in the mountains somewhere." "The rituals?" Mitchell prompted gently. "What did they do to you?" Alexander's face contorted with remembered pain. "They called it purification. Father Victor would read from scripture, then heat iron rods in a brazier until they glowed. He'd press them against my skin, saying each burn was cleansing a sin. Pride, greed, vanity. He had a whole list. My hands." He held up his scarred palms. "These were for the sin of never having worked for anything. My face was for the sin of physical beauty. My neck was for the sin of speaking with authority I hadn't earned." The room was silent except for Elena's quiet sobbing. Rodriguez, standing by the door, looked pale. Mitchell maintained her professional composure, but fury burned in her chest. "How did you escape, Mr. Voss?" she asked. Alexander's expression showed something that might have been relief or guilt. Mitchell couldn't tell. "I didn't escape. They let me go. Yesterday morning, Father Victor came to my cell and said my purification was complete. He said I'd proven my faith through suffering, that I'd been reborn as a humble servant of God. He had his men drive me to Boston, blindfolded, and drop me off about 2 miles from the estate. He said if I told anyone what happened, if I tried to find them, they'd come back for my mother next, that she needed purification too." Mitchell leaned forward. "Mr. Voss, We will find these people and ensure they never hurt anyone again. But I need you to tell me everything you can remember. Every detail about Father Victor, about the location, about the other men. Anything that might help us identify them." Alexander nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "But detective, you need to understand. These weren't just criminals. They believed they were doing God's work. They were fanatics. And Father Victor said they had other purification candidates waiting. He said there were others like me, children of privilege who needed to suffer to understand true faith. We have to find them before they take someone else." The investigation exploded into action within hours of Alexander's return. Detective Mitchell assembled a task force that included FBI agents, state police, and specialists from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. The conference room at Boston Police Headquarters became Command Central, its walls quickly covered with maps, photographs, and timeline charts. At the center of everything was a single question: where had Alexander Voss been held for 6 months? FBI Special Agent Marcus Thompson, a veteran of hostage rescue operations, took point on the geographical analysis. Alexander mentioned mountains, extreme cold even in summer, and isolation, Thompson said, pointing to a map of New England spread across the table. "That narrows our search to higher elevations. The White Mountains in New Hampshire, the Green Mountains in Vermont, the Adirondacks in upstate New York. We're looking at hundreds of square miles of potential territory." Detective Rodriguez added another layer to the analysis. He described the structure as old stone construction, with vaulted ceilings like a chapel. That suggests we're looking for abandoned religious buildings, monasteries, convents, retreats. Something built in the 19th or early 20th century that's fallen into disuse. He pulled up a database on his laptop. "I've been researching defunct religious properties in the region. There are 47 abandoned or decommissioned religious structures within a 3-state radius that match the basic description." Mitchell reviewed Alexander's statement transcript for the 100th time, searching for details that might narrow the search. He said he could hear wind constantly, strong wind. That suggests an exposed location, probably on or near a ridgeline. And he mentioned the drive from the location to Boston took several hours while he was blindfolded. If we estimate they kept to back roads to avoid detection, that puts the radius somewhere between 100 and 200 miles from the city. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rachel Goldstein, Alexander's attending physician, had been conducting detailed examinations of his injuries. She called Mitchell directly on Tuesday evening. "Detective, I've been analyzing the burn patterns on Mr. Voss's skin," she explained. "The scars show a consistent methodology. The implements used were all the same temperature, applied with the same pressure in deliberate patterns. Whoever did this had practice. This wasn't their first time." Mitchell felt her pulse quicken. "Are you saying there might be other victims?" Dr. Goldstein's voice was grim. "I'm saying the precision and consistency of these injuries suggest a developed technique. In my 15 years of treating burn victims, I've never seen anything quite like this. The person who inflicted these wounds knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to cause maximum pain while avoiding fatal injuries. That level of expertise doesn't develop overnight." The task force immediately began searching for similar cases, missing persons who had reappeared with unexplained injuries, unsolved disappearances involving young adults from wealthy families, any reports of religious extremist activity in the region. FBI databases were queried. Interpol was contacted to search European records, given the suspect's German name and Alexander's family background. The scope of the investigation expanded exponentially. Meanwhile, at Massachusetts General Hospital, Alexander continued his physical recovery while beginning the much longer process of psychological healing. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a trauma specialist, had been assigned to his case. During their sessions, Alexander revealed details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of his captivity. "There were books in the room where they kept me," he told Dr. Martinez during one session. "Religious texts, but not normal ones. Father Victor had written notes in the margins, interpretations that twisted scripture into justifications for torture. He truly believed he was saving souls through suffering. Alexander described the daily routine of his captivity with clinical detachment, a coping mechanism Dr. Martinez recognized as dissociation. They fed me once a day. Bread and water, sometimes thin soup. Father Victor said fasting was part of the purification. The rituals happened every few days at first, then less frequently. He said he had to space them out to give my body time to heal enough for the next session. He didn't want me to die. He wanted me to live through it, to be transformed by the suffering. The psychological profile that emerged painted Father Victor Hahn as a dangerous religious fanatic with a sophisticated understanding of torture and indoctrination. FBI behavioral analysts determined he likely had formal religious training that had been corrupted by extremist ideology. A deep dive into Catholic Church records revealed a Victor Hahn who had been ordained in Germany in 1978, served in various parishes until 1998, and was then defrocked following allegations of inappropriate conduct. After that, his trail went cold until now. He's been underground for 17 years, Agent Thompson noted during a briefing. That's a long time to develop a following, establish a base of operations, and plan something like this. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to kidnap a prince. This was calculated. He likely has financial resources, a network of supporters, and most concerning, a specific ideology that identifies targets based on wealth and social status. The search for the location intensified. Helicopter flyovers were conducted over promising areas. Local law enforcement in New Hampshire, Vermont, and upstate New York were briefed and asked to check abandoned religious properties in their jurisdictions. Tips from the public poured in following a carefully worded press release that mentioned the search for an abandoned stone structure, without revealing why. None of the leads produced results. On Thursday, October 15th, 3 days after Alexander's return, the investigation caught its first real break. A retired postal worker named Gerald Murphy called the tip line after seeing a news report about the search. "I used to deliver mail in the White Mountains back in the 90s, Murphy explained to the detective who took his call. There was this old monastery up near Mount Washington, St. Benedict's Retreat they called it. Franciscan monks ran it until the early 80s, then it was abandoned. I remember delivering mail there a few times for a caretaker who was living there trying to maintain the property. German fellow, very intense. Religious pictures all over his cabin. I remember thinking he was a bit off." The detective pressed for more details. Murphy provided directions to a remote location off Route 16, accessible only by a deteriorating dirt road that wound up into the mountains. "It's been 20 years since I was up there," Murphy cautioned. "But the monastery was all stone construction, built into the mountainside. Beautiful architecture, but isolated as hell. Perfect place to disappear if you wanted to get away from the world." Within an hour, a tactical team was being assembled. Agent Thompson led the planning session, treating the operation as a potential hostage rescue despite Alexander being safe. "If Father Victor has other victims, as we suspect, we go in prepared for anything. Full tactical gear, medical support on standby, negotiators ready. We don't know what we're going to find up there, but we're taking every precaution." The convoy departed Boston at dawn on Friday, October 16th. 6 FBI vehicles, 4 state police cruisers, 2 ambulances, and a mobile command unit wound their way north through New Hampshire. The autumn foliage was at peak color, brilliant reds and golds covering the mountains. A beautiful landscape that seemed at odds with the dark purpose of their mission. Detective Mitchell rode with Agent Thompson, reviewing Alexander's statement and the limited intelligence they had on the monastery. The final approach had to be made on foot. The dirt road Murphy had mentioned was barely passable, overgrown and washed out in places. The tactical team parked a mile from the reported location and proceeded on foot through dense forest. The air grew noticeably colder as they climbed, and Mitchell could hear the wind Alexander had described, a constant presence that whistled through the trees and around rocky outcrops. St. Benedict's Retreat emerged from the forest like something from a Gothic novel. The main structure was 3 stories of gray stone, weathered by decades of harsh mountain weather. A small chapel with a bell tower stood adjacent to the main building, its copper roof green with patina. Outbuildings, what might have been dormitories or workshops, flanked the complex. Everything looked abandoned, windows dark, vegetation growing wild around the foundations. But smoke rose from a chimney in one of the outbuildings. The tactical team moved into position, surrounding the complex with practiced efficiency. Thompson gave the order to advance. Agents approached the smoking chimney building with weapons drawn, calling out identification and commands to exit. The door opened, and an elderly man emerged with his hands raised. He was in his 70s, thin with a long white beard and wearing monk's robes. "I am alone here," he said in heavily accented English. "I am Brother Thomas, I am the caretaker." The building was cleared quickly, one room, sparsely furnished, with evidence of recent occupation but no signs of other people. Brother Thomas was detained for questioning while teams began searching the other structures. The main monastery building was a maze of corridors and rooms, many filled with debris and evidence of water damage. The chapel was empty except for dust and pigeon droppings. It seemed like another dead end. Then Agent Sarah Chen, searching the chapel's sacristy, noticed something odd about the floor. A section of stone tiles appeared newer than the surrounding area, the mortar between them fresher, less weathered. "Thompson, you need to see this," she called out. The team gathered as Chen and another agent pried up the tiles, revealing a wooden trapdoor underneath. Thompson pulled it open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The basement was exactly as Alexander had described. A vaulted stone chamber, cold and damp, with iron rings set into the walls. A brazier sat in one corner, still containing cold ashes. The walls bore scorch marks. In an adjacent room, they found a cot with chains attached to the frame, dried blood on the thin mattress. Medical supplies were stored in cabinets along one wall. Bandages, antiseptics, antibiotics, everything needed to keep someone alive through repeated trauma. But most disturbing was what they found in a third chamber. A wooden desk held journals filled with meticulous notes in German script. On the walls, Father Victor had created what amounted to a shrine, photographs of young people, all appearing to be in their 20s or 30s, all dressed in expensive clothes or formal wear. Each photograph had annotations listing their supposed sins and the purification rituals they required. Alexander's photograph was there, marked with dates and notes. But there were 6 others as well, faces of young people whose fates were unknown. Mitchell photographed every page of the journals, every image on the walls. Forensic teams began processing the scene, collecting evidence that would help build a case against Father Victor and anyone who had assisted him. But the immediate question remained unanswered. Where was Victor Hahn now, and who were the 6 other people whose photographs decorated his walls? Brother Thomas, questioned extensively, claimed ignorance of the basement chamber. He maintained he was simply a caretaker who lived on the property, tending the grounds and praying in solitude. He admitted knowing Father Victor. "Father Victor comes sometimes to pray," Thomas said, but claimed no knowledge of criminal activity. His story seemed implausible, but without evidence directly connecting him to Alexander's captivity, they couldn't hold him on anything more than trespassing charges. As sunset painted the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Mitchell stood outside the chapel, looking at the remote, beautiful, terrible place where Alexander had suffered for 6 months. They had found the location. They had evidence. But Father Victor Hahn remained free, somewhere out there, possibly with other victims in his control. The investigation had taken a major step forward, but the most dangerous work still lay ahead. The discovery at St. Benedict's Retreat transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a manhunt. By Saturday morning, Father Victor Hahn's face was on every news channel in America and across Europe. The FBI issued a nationwide alert, posting his photograph, reconstructed from a 20-year-old church directory, at airports, bus stations, and border crossings. Interpol circulated the image internationally. The man who had tortured Alexander Voss for 6 months had become one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. Detective Mitchell returned to Boston Saturday afternoon, exhausted but driven by a sense of urgency that wouldn't let her rest. The 6 photographs found on Father Victor's wall haunted her. 6 young faces, 6 potential victims, 6 families who might be living through the same nightmare the Voss family had endured. The FBI's missing persons database was already being searched, cross-referencing the photographs with unsolved disappearances over the past decade. By Sunday evening, they had identified 3 of the 6. The first was Christina Marlowe, 26, daughter of a prominent New York real estate developer, reported missing in September 2013 while hiking in the Catskills. The second was David Chen, 29, son of a Silicon Valley tech billionaire, who vanished in June 2014 after leaving a conference in Burlington, Vermont. The third was Elena Rostova, 25, granddaughter of a Russian oil oligarch who had disappeared in March 2015 while studying at Harvard. All 3 cases had been investigated extensively with no resolution. Now their photographs hung on Victor Hahn's wall of intended or completed victims. 3 confirmed victims, 3 still unidentified, Agent Thompson said during Monday's briefing. And that's assuming the unidentified 3 are still alive. We need to consider the possibility that Hahn has killed before, that Alexander was simply the most recent in a series. The thought made Mitchell's stomach turn. Alexander had survived, but how many others hadn't been so fortunate? The breakthrough in finding Father Victor came from an unexpected direction. On Tuesday morning, a parish priest in Albany, New York, called the FBI tip line. Father Michael Brennan had been watching the news coverage and recognized Victor Hahn from an encounter 3 months earlier. He came to our church in July, Father Brennan explained to the agent who took his call. He wanted to use our confession booth, said he was traveling and needed to make confession. I was busy with parish duties, so I directed him to Father Walsh. Afterward, Father Walsh seemed disturbed but wouldn't tell me what was said. Confession is sacred, you understand? The agent pressed gently. Father Brennan, this man is suspected of kidnapping and torture. If Father Walsh heard something that might help us locate him, lives could be at stake. There was a long pause before Father Brennan responded. Father Walsh passed away 2 weeks ago, heart attack. He was 78, but he kept detailed journals, personal reflections, thoughts about his ministry. I've been going through his effects to prepare them for the diocese archives. There might be something there that could help without violating the seal of confession. FBI agents were in Albany within 3 hours. Father Walsh's journals were extensive, decades of observations, prayers, and reflections on his work. The entry from July 15, 2015 stood out immediately. While Father Walsh didn't explicitly reveal what was said in confession, his personal reflections afterward were revealing. Today I heard confession from a man whose faith has been twisted into something monstrous. He spoke of purification through suffering, of saving souls by destroying the body. He believes God has given him a mission to humble the proud through pain. I am deeply troubled. He asked for God's blessing on his work. I could not give it. After he left, I found he had left a donation envelope with no return address, but postmarked from Littleton, New Hampshire. I fear for whoever crosses this man's path. Littleton was a small town in the White Mountains, 40 miles from St. Benedict's retreat. The FBI descended on the area immediately, showing Father Victor's photograph to every business owner, hotel clerk, and resident they could find. Most people didn't recognize him, but on Wednesday afternoon, a clerk at a hardware store remembered selling rope, chains, and medical supplies to a man matching Victor's description several times over the past 2 years. He always paid cash, the clerk recalled. Never said much, but I remember thinking it was odd, the combination of things he bought. Construction supplies mixed with first aid equipment, and he always bought in bulk. The clerk's record showed the most recent purchase had been made just 2 weeks ago, days before Alexander's release. He came in on September 28th, the clerk said, checking his receipts. Bought heavy-duty chains, padlocks, and a large quantity of bandages and antibiotics. Said he was stocking up for winter preparations at a remote property. The FBI immediately began canvassing the area for any property sales, rentals, or abandoned buildings that might serve as a secondary location. Meanwhile, Alexander's recovery continued at the hospital, though he insisted on helping with the investigation, despite his doctor's objections. On Thursday, he met with a forensic artist to provide detailed descriptions of the 4 men who had assisted Father Victor. They were all around the same age, Alexander explained, his scarred hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of tea. 40s to 50s. They spoke English with various accents. One sounded German, another Eastern European, maybe Russian or Polish. They wore simple robes like monks, and they rarely spoke. Father Victor did most of the talking during the rituals. The descriptions were circulated immediately, and by Friday afternoon, one of the men had been tentatively identified. Border Patrol agents at the Canadian crossing in Vermont reported detaining a man matching one of the descriptions on October 14th, 2 days after Alexander's release. The man, traveling on a German passport under the name Klaus Weber, had aroused suspicion by appearing nervous and providing vague answers about his travel plans. He had been photographed and fingerprinted as part of routine processing before being allowed to continue into Canada. FBI agents in Montreal tracked Klaus Weber to a cheap motel near the airport, but he had already checked out and boarded a flight to Frankfurt. German authorities were notified and met the flight upon arrival, detaining Weber for questioning. Under interrogation, Weber's story fell apart quickly. His real name was Klaus Brenner, a former seminary student who had been expelled in the 1990s for extremist views. He admitted to being part of Father Victor's group but claimed he had only provided logistical support, securing supplies, maintaining the monastery property, and had never directly participated in the torture. Father Victor is a true believer, Brenner told German investigators, his statement transmitted immediately to the FBI. He thinks modern society has lost its way, that the wealthy and privileged need to be humbled before God. He's been planning this for years, recruiting people who share his vision of purification through suffering. But I swear, I didn't hurt anyone. I just helped with the practical matters. I left because I couldn't watch anymore. What he did to that young man, to all of them, it was too much. The phrase "all of them" sent chills through the investigation team. Brenner was pressed for details about other victims. He provided information that confirmed their worst fears. Christina Marlowe, David Chen, and Elena Rostova were all dead, their bodies buried in unmarked graves in the mountains. They had not survived their purification. Alexander had been the first to live through the complete process, Father Victor's first success in his twisted mission. The news was devastating. 3 families would now receive confirmation that their missing children were dead, murdered by a religious fanatic. But Brenner's information also provided a crucial lead. He revealed that Father Victor maintained a second location, a backup site in case St. Benedict's was ever discovered. "It's in Vermont," Brenner said, "an old farmhouse near the Canadian border. He bought it years ago under a false name. That's where he would go if he needed to disappear. And that's where..." Brenner hesitated, his face pale. "That's where he's holding the next one. A young woman. He took her 3 weeks ago. I don't know her name, but she's from a wealthy family. He's starting the purification process with her now." The FBI mobilized immediately. Vermont State Police were briefed and tactical teams assembled. Using property records and Brenner's description of the location, near Jay Peak, accessible only by a logging road, they identified a farmhouse that had been purchased in 2008 by a shell company with connections to European bank accounts. Satellite imagery showed the property appeared maintained, despite being listed as vacant. Thermal imaging from a surveillance flight detected heat signatures consistent with recent occupation. At dawn on Saturday, October 24th, 12 days after Alexander's return, a joint FBI and state police tactical team surrounded the Vermont farmhouse. Unlike the monastery, this operation was executed with overwhelming force. The element of surprise was critical. Within minutes, the property was secured. Father Victor Hahn was found in the basement in the middle of conducting a ritual. Chained to the wall was Rebecca Hastings, 24-year-old daughter of a Boston pharmaceutical executive who had been reported missing on October 1st. She was alive, traumatized, bearing fresh burn marks on her arms, but alive. Father Victor offered no resistance when arrested. His face was calm, almost serene, as agents placed him in handcuffs. "God's work cannot be stopped by earthly authorities," he said quietly as he was led away. "Others will continue the purification. The proud will be humbled. The wealthy will know suffering. His words were chilling in their conviction, suggesting a network that might extend beyond the people already identified. The arrest of Father Victor Hahn made international headlines, but for Detective Mitchell and the task force, it marked the beginning of a new phase rather than the end. The investigation now focused on documenting evidence, identifying any remaining accomplices, and building an airtight case that would ensure Victor and his associates never walked free. The legal proceedings would be complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and international cooperation, but everyone involved was determined to see justice served. Rebecca Hastings was rushed to the University of Vermont Medical Center in Burlington, where she received immediate care for her injuries. Her parents, who had been living through 3 weeks of unimaginable horror since her disappearance, arrived within hours. The reunion was emotional and painful. Rebecca was alive, but she bore the physical and psychological scars of her ordeal. Dr. Martinez, who had been treating Alexander, was flown in to consult on Rebecca's care, providing continuity and expertise in dealing with this specific type of trauma. Alexander insisted on meeting Rebecca once she was stable enough for visitors. The meeting took place on Tuesday, October 27th, in a private consultation room at the hospital. Both were accompanied by their therapists, and the session was carefully managed to avoid re-traumatizing either survivor. When Alexander entered the room, Rebecca looked up from her wheelchair, her arms bandaged, her face drawn, but her eyes showing recognition of a shared experience that no one else could fully understand. "You survived," Alexander said simply, sitting down across from her. "You're stronger than he thought you were. Stronger than any of us thought possible." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. He said, I would die like the others, that I wasn't strong enough for purification. But then the police came." Her voice broke. "You got away. You saved me by getting away." Alexander shook his head. "We saved each other. Your disappearance helped them find him. Your strength kept you alive long enough to be rescued. We're both survivors now." The conversation between them lasted nearly an hour, two people who had experienced the same nightmare finding solace in shared understanding. Dr. Martinez later noted in her report that the meeting marked a turning point for both patients, the beginning of accepting what had happened while refusing to let it define their futures. They exchanged contact information and promised to support each other through the recovery process and the trials that lay ahead. Father Victor Hahn's arraignment took place on November 3rd in federal court in Burlington. The charges were extensive: 4 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of first-degree murder for Christina Marlowe, David Chen, and Elena Rostova, multiple counts of torture and assault and conspiracy charges. He entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands and feet shackled, his expression showing no remorse. When asked how he pleaded, he responded in a clear voice, "I am guilty of nothing but serving God's will. These charges are meaningless before divine judgment." The judge ordered him held without bail, citing overwhelming evidence and extreme danger to the public. As Victor was led from the courtroom, he looked directly at the section where Alexander sat beside his mother, and Rebecca sat with her parents. "Your suffering has made you worthy," he called out before guards silenced him. "You should thank me for your salvation." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and he refused to give Victor the satisfaction of seeing fear or anger. The investigation continued to uncover the scope of Victor's network. Klaus Brenner's testimony led to the arrest of 2 more accomplices: Dmitry Volkov, a former Russian Orthodox monk who had helped with logistics, and Franz Müller, a German national who had provided financial support through offshore accounts. Brother Thomas, the caretaker at St. Benedict's Retreat, was also charged with accessory to kidnapping, after forensic evidence proved he had been present during at least one of the torture sessions. All 4 men faced lengthy prison sentences. The recovery of the victims' bodies was a grim task that stretched through November. Search teams, guided by Brenner's information and ground-penetrating radar, located 3 burial sites in the White Mountains. Christina Marlowe's remains were found first, buried in a shallow grave half a mile from St. Benedict's Retreat. David Chen's body was discovered 3 days later in a similar location. Elena Rostova's remains were the hardest to find, buried deeper and farther from the monastery. But persistent searching finally located her on November 18th. Each discovery brought closure to families who had been living in agonizing uncertainty. But the closure came with devastating confirmation of their worst fears. Memorial services were held, media coverage was intense, and the public outcry against religious extremism reached a fever pitch. Duchess Elena Voss, now understanding how close she had come to losing Alexander permanently, attended each memorial service, offering her support to families who had not been as fortunate as hers. Alexander's physical recovery progressed steadily through November and December. He regained most of the weight he had lost, though his body would always bear the scars of his captivity. The psychological recovery was slower and more complex. He suffered from nightmares, anxiety attacks, and moments of dissociation that Dr. Martinez explained were normal responses to trauma. But he also showed remarkable resilience, channeling his experience into advocacy work that would help other survivors. On December 15th, 3 months after his return, Alexander gave his first public interview. Sitting in the library of the Voss estate with a carefully selected journalist, he spoke candidly about his ordeal for the first time. "I want people to understand that religious extremism doesn't always look like what we expect," he said, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. Father Victor presented himself as a man of God. He quoted scripture, he believed he was doing holy work. That's what makes extremism so dangerous. The perpetrators are often convinced they're righteous. The interview, broadcast internationally, sparked important conversations about recognizing warning signs of extremist ideology and protecting vulnerable people from predatory individuals who use religion as a weapon. Alexander announced the formation of the Survivors Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting victims of religious extremism and funding research into preventing radicalization. Duchess Elena pledged the $5 million reward money that had never been claimed as the foundation's initial funding. Rebecca Hastings joined Alexander in his advocacy work, making her first public appearance at the foundation's announcement. Standing beside him at a press conference, her arms still bandaged but her voice strong, she spoke about the importance of survivors telling their stories. "We can't let shame or fear silence us," she said. "What happened to us was evil, but we're still here. We survived. And by speaking out, maybe we can prevent this from happening to someone else." The trials began in March 2016. Father Victor Hans was the first and most publicized. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: Alexander's testimony, Rebecca's testimony, forensic evidence from both locations, the victim's remains, Victor's own journals detailing his ideology and methods, and testimony from his accomplices. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity due to religious delusion, but the meticulous planning and calculated nature of Victor's actions undermined any insanity defense. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the judge addressed Victor directly. "You have perverted faith into justification for torture and murder. You have caused immeasurable suffering to innocent people and their families. Society must be protected from individuals like you permanently." Victor Hahn was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus 250 years on the additional counts. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read. The trials of Victor Hahn's accomplices followed through the spring and summer of 2016. Klaus Brenner, who had cooperated with authorities, received a reduced sentence of 25 years. Dmitry Volkov and Franz Miller were each sentenced to 40 years without parole. Brother Thomas, whose participation had been less extensive but still culpable, received 15 years. The legal proceedings brought a measure of justice, but for the survivors and the families of the deceased, the emotional wounds would take far longer to heal. Alexander threw himself into building the Survivors Foundation with an intensity that concerned his therapists, but also demonstrated his determination to transform his trauma into something meaningful. By August 2016, the foundation had established a 24-hour helpline for people concerned about extremist recruitment, funded 3 research studies on radicalization patterns, and provided financial assistance to 12 families affected by religious violence. The work was demanding, but Alexander found purpose in it that helped him reclaim control over his life. His relationship with Rebecca evolved from shared trauma into genuine friendship. They spoke regularly, comparing notes on their recovery processes and supporting each other through difficult moments. Rebecca had returned to her graduate studies in psychology, channeling her experience into academic research on trauma recovery. "I think understanding what happened to us clinically helps me process it emotionally," she explained during one of their coffee meetings in Boston. "If I can study it, analyze it, maybe I can make sense of it." Duchess Elena watched her son's transformation with mixed emotions. She was proud of his advocacy work and his resilience, but she mourned the carefree young man he had been before April 2015. "He's stronger now, but harder too," she confided to Margaret one evening. "The innocence is gone. He sees darkness in the world that he never noticed before." Margaret, ever practical, responded gently. "But he also sees light worth fighting for. That's what matters. He survived, and he's using that survival to help others. Many people who experience such trauma never recover that sense of purpose." Detective Mitchell stayed in contact with Alexander throughout the legal proceedings and beyond. She had worked hundreds of cases in her career, but this one had affected her differently. Perhaps it was the randomness of it. Alexander had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, making himself vulnerable to a predator who had been waiting for someone exactly like him. Or perhaps it was witnessing his transformation from victim to advocate. Whatever the reason, she found herself attending the Foundation's events and volunteering her time to help train others in recognizing warning signs of extremist activity. The one-year anniversary of Alexander's disappearance fell on April 14, 2016. Rather than letting the date pass quietly, Alexander chose to mark it with a memorial service at St. Michael's Cathedral, the place where his nightmare had begun. The event was open to the public and hundreds attended, including families of other extremism victims, law enforcement officials who had worked the case, and members of the media who had followed the story from the beginning. Father Patrick O'Brien, who had been devastated to learn his cathedral had been the site where Alexander was targeted, presided over the service. "We gather today not to dwell on darkness, but to celebrate the light that persists even in our darkest moments," he said in his homily. Alexander Voss walked out of this church 1 year ago and into a nightmare. But he emerged from that nightmare with his humanity intact, with compassion for others, and with determination to prevent such evil from claiming more victims. That is the triumph of the human spirit over evil. Alexander addressed the gathering, speaking from the same spot near the altar where he had knelt in prayer that fateful afternoon. His scars were visible. He made no attempt to hide them with makeup or strategic positioning. "A year ago, I was a different person," he began, his voice carrying through the cathedral. "I was privileged, sheltered, and honestly, I took my safety for granted. I thought bad things happened to other people, not to someone like me. Father Victor Hahn taught me that evil doesn't discriminate. It finds anyone who's vulnerable, anyone who can be isolated and controlled." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But he also inadvertently taught me something else. He thought he could break me, could purify me through suffering into someone who would accept his twisted worldview. He failed. Every moment I spent in that basement, every scar he carved into my skin, every word of his poisonous ideology, none of it changed who I fundamentally am. I'm still Alexander Voss. I'm still my father's son and my mother's child. I still believe in human dignity, in justice, in the possibility of redemption. Not the kind Victor preached, but real redemption that comes from acknowledging harm and working to prevent it." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. "The scars I carry now are permanent. They'll never fade completely. But they remind me every day that I survived something that killed 3 other people. Christina Marlowe, David Chen, Elena Rostova, they deserve to live, to have futures, to stand here themselves and tell their stories. Since they can't, I have a responsibility to tell mine, to make sure their deaths weren't meaningless, to prevent others from suffering the same fate." Rebecca stood and joined him at the front of the cathedral, followed by the parents of Christina, David, and Elena. Together, they unveiled a memorial plaque that would be permanently installed in the cathedral's vestibule. It bore the names of the 3 victims and a simple inscription: "In memory of those lost to extremism. May their lives inspire vigilance against hatred disguised as faith." The service concluded with a candlelight vigil on the cathedral steps. As darkness fell over Boston, hundreds of candles flickered in the evening breeze, each flame representing a commitment to remembering the victims and protecting potential future ones. News cameras captured the scene, broadcasting it around the world, an image of hope and resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. In the months that followed, life gradually found a new normal for Alexander. He continued his foundation work while slowly reintegrating into social activities he had avoided since his return. He began dating again, tentatively at first, finding it difficult to trust and be vulnerable with someone new. His relationship with Sarah Chen, a journalist he met at a foundation event, developed slowly but steadily. She understood his need to take things at his own pace and never pushed him to talk about his trauma before he was ready. Duchess Elena's health improved as she watched her son rebuild his life. The stress of his disappearance and the subsequent months had taken a physical toll. She had developed high blood pressure and anxiety that required medication. But seeing Alexander find peace allowed her to begin healing as well. She became involved in the foundation's work, using her connections in European aristocratic circles to raise awareness and funds for anti-extremism initiatives. By the time the second anniversary of Alexander's disappearance arrived in April 2017, the transformation was remarkable. The foundation had grown to employ 15 people full-time and had helped hundreds of families affected by extremism. Alexander had testified before Congress about the need for better monitoring of extremist groups and improved support for survivors of ideological violence. Rebecca had published her first academic paper on trauma recovery, citing their experiences as case studies. The legal proceedings had concluded with all perpetrators in prison. Father Victor Hahn remained in maximum security federal prison, where reports indicated he continued to hold to his extremist beliefs and attempted to recruit other inmates to his ideology. He was kept in isolation to prevent him from spreading his influence. Alexander had been asked several times if he wanted to meet with Victor, perhaps to find closure or understanding. He always declined. "There's nothing he could say that would give me closure," Alexander explained. "Closure comes from what I do with my life now, not from anything he might say or do." On a warm evening in June 2017, Alexander stood on the balcony of the Voss estate, looking out over Boston's skyline. His mother joined him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud of you," she said softly. "Not because of what you survived, but because of who you've become because of it." Alexander covered her hand with his own, his scarred, damaged hand that would never look the way it once had, but that had learned to function again, to create, to comfort, to build. "I think about them sometimes," Alexander said. "Christina, David, Elena. I wonder who they would have become if they'd survived, what they would have accomplished, the families they might have had." Elena squeezed his shoulder. "You honor them by living fully, by not letting what happened make you bitter or broken. That's the best memorial you can give them." Alexander nodded, watching the sun set over the city where his nightmare had begun and where his recovery continued. The scars would never disappear. They were part of him now, part of his story. But they were no longer the whole story. He had survived, fought back against evil, and found purpose in his pain. That was enough. That had to be enough. And somehow, standing there with his mother as another day ended and another began, it was.